the king, when D'Eon returns to Paris, the king grants them a very large pension in exchange for finally getting his hands on the stash of secret papers that D'Eon has been carrying around at the time. But the terms and conditions of those pensions stated that from that time on, D'Eon, who is then dressing and living as a man, must dress and live as a woman.
Welcome to History's Greatest Scandals. In this series, we're uncovering the secrets of the Georgian era. And joining me to explore the highs and lows of British society in the 18th and early 19th centuries is Professor Hannah Greig, a historian, author, and a historical consultant on dramas including Poldark, The Favourite, and Bridgerton. We'll be following on the trail of forgers, uncovering illicit liaisons, meeting cross-dressing celebrity spies, and getting involved in some high-stakes gambling, as we search out some of the biggest scandals of the day and explore what they can reveal about the Georgian age.
So, Ellie, if I say to you the name Chevalier D'Eon, what image does that conjure up for you?
Well, I think Chevalier particularly. I'm thinking of French romances. I'm thinking of swashbuckling and adventures and kind of musketeers. Is that the right ballpark?
Yeah, you kind of imagine Musketeer story, don't you?
Yeah.
It's not far off where we're headed, to be honest. For our episode today, we are looking at a figure whose very action-packed biography features high-stakes gambling, there's some spying, there's duels, there's blackmailing of royalty, and that's not even mentioning the biggest reason that they caused a stir. Today's story isn't so much just one scandal, it's absolutely full of them. So come with me, Ellie, to 1771, and we can see that a gambling craze has taken hold of London.
Okay.
So according to the newspaper The London Evening Post, the amount of money being wagered in this gambling moment was over £60,000 by the middle of the year. And the subject of this gambling craze, of all of these bets, it's not sport, it's not horse racing or anything like that. It's not even the outcome of an election. It is whether or not one individual was in fact a man or a woman.
Okay, and who is this person? I'm guessing it might be the Chevalier D'Eon that you introduced me to at the beginning.
Yes, let me introduce you to this larger-than-life character who's going to be the subject of today's episode. They are a diplomat, a spy, a celebrity, and also a very skilled swordsman or fencer. Born into a minor aristocratic family in France in 1728, the Chevalier D'Eon lived in London from 1762 to 1777, and then again in London from 1785 to 1810. Now, it's quite difficult actually to trace their history or their biography with any great certainty because this individual is the heart of some spy networks of the 18th century. So I want you to think about some sort of cross between Musketeers and James Bond. That's where we're heading today. But then there was also a lot of kind of contemporary speculation and rumour surrounding their persona. And, you know, what we know about their life does seem to be incredibly remarkable and extraordinary. And the gambling that took place over their gender or their sex is only one aspect of that story.
We'll return to the question of gender later and why that caused such a big stir. But let's stay for a moment on Musketeers meets James Bond, diplomacy and spying. What exactly was the Chevalier getting up to?
So D'Eon first arrived in London in 1762 as part of a diplomatic team, effectively, who are negotiating the Peace of Paris, which is the treaty that ends the 7 Years' War. Now, prior to their arrival in London, D'Eon has already enjoyed quite a glittering career in France as a diplomat and a soldier in the 1750s. And that comes after an equally kind of impressive record and career of academic study and study of the law. So they're already considered to be an exceptional, interesting person. And now, although they arrive in London in 1762 presenting as a man, D'Eon was said to have been interested in cross-dressing previously, reported to have attended a number of balls dressed as a woman. They also purchased women's clothing, including corsets, when they were in London.
And is this a new thing in London? Is this the first instance we know of the Chevalier using different genders?
Well, there seems to be some suggestion that there's a longer history to this. So that on a previous diplomatic mission to Russia in the 1750s, where D'Eon had been sent to try and persuade the Russian Empress to be an ally with France against England and the Prussians. So D'Eon goes to Russia in the 1750s. And on this mission, they are said to have adopted two different personas. So one is a female, Leah de Beaumont, who integrates into the Empress's inner circle, and then also her brother. And both of those individuals are said to be D'Eon, once dressed as a woman and once dressed as a man. So he's playing two parts at the same time. So, whether this is due to their own interests or because it's part of their diplomatic identity, it's impossible to say.
I love this idea of them playing a brother and a sister, both in this kind of spy
But they can never be in the same room at the same time. So, can imagine. So this idea of D'Eon playing two different sexes, a man and a woman, seems to have a longer history. And it's also something that they carry with them on their arrival in London. And when this individual becomes the subject of kind of popular interest and curiosity, we see a number of prints being produced which kind of play on this idea that they are two people combined. So, Ellie, if you want to have a look at this one, which is a bit later from 1778, but I think you'll see here what I'm getting at.
So, we've got this kind of two-sided figure, almost like conjoined twins, it looks like, and one side is very exaggeratedly male.
With a very large sword.
And a very large pair of boots, a kind of swashbuckling figure. And then on the other side, we have an exaggerated caricature of a woman with, this low-cut top and the big hair and the hat on top and the fan. But it's this sense that they have the same face. So it's this, as you say, this like two-faced dual identity. Mm-hmm. Really well captured there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, one of the things that's interesting about when D'Eon first arrives in London and the kind of career that they are known to have behind them is they are clearly considered to be incredibly effective as a diplomat and a spy. They are entrusted with very important missions, secret information, and, are clearly highly skilled at this kind of adopting of personas. It's like all the things you want of a true spy. And, when they arrive in London in the 1760s, they are part of Louis XV's spy network. So at precisely the time in which England believes themselves to be negotiating a peace with France, of course, France is at the same time trying to plot a revenge. And that's really what D'Eon is doing in London, is playing both of those roles again, these two identities at once. One as a peacemaker and the other as a possible troublemaker further down the line. So they're clearly entrusted with this very important role and mission. But for some reason, soon after arriving in London, the Chevalier becomes kind of concerned about their future prospects in France because they are in a difficult position, and there's the possibility that they will fall foul of different competing political groups in France. And at one point, D'Eon is actually recalled to France, removed from the mission effectively, but they refuse to return.
But surely disobeying orders, royal orders, if I'm right, like that is quite a risky move.
Yes, it's basically a command to come back, and they say no. I'm staying here. And, they also then become even more audacious and kind of impressive, really, because, D'Eon is running short of funds in London. They've been living quite an extravagant lifestyle, trying to keep up appearances, move in the right circles and things like that, beginning to run up debts. And so what D'Eon then begins to do is effectively attempt to start blackmailing the king, Louis XV, by saying they will gradually publish accounts of not only the diplomatic manoeuvres that have been taking place, but also some of the secrets of the secret spy network. and offers a taster of what might come by producing a kind of fairly scandalous account of certain kind of political intrigues and diplomatic missions, keeping back some of the super secret spy stuff. But it's enough to start to unnerve, France.
Well, it's a pretty ballsy move, isn't it? Chevalier wasn't afraid to take a gamble then.
No, it's huge. I mean, it's kind of huge, isn't it? Just take on a country, take on a nation. And D'Eon is successful. They secure a pension at first from France in order to just keep them quiet. And they continue to live in London and become something of a celebrity, actually, at that moment because of these publications, because they are known to be a whistleblower, because they have kind of revealed themselves to be at the heart of this diplomatic story. There is a suggestion they are part of a spy network, although they haven't actually given up any real official secrets. So that they become something of a celebrity because of these publications and their presentation as a kind of whistle-blowing diplomat. But there's even more celebrity to come.
So this female persona that the Chevalier adopted on their espionage and their diplomatic missions, can we tell whether it was a ruse to help with spying efforts or whether it was more of a question of identity, more than that?
I think it's very difficult to make those judgments retrospectively. All we really know is that Chevalier D'Eon was dressing as both a man and a woman and successfully presenting as both sexes. We know that when they arrive in London in 1762, they are dressing and presenting as a man. But there seems to be some swirling suggestion that they are not always dressing as a man, that they are sometimes also still dressing as a woman, that they have an interest in women's clothing. Were they actually born a woman and they're presenting as a man? So some of those stories are already beginning to swirl. Now, some people might argue that their choice of different sorts of clothing and different kinds of identities was a strategic and kind of political choice. It's part of their espionage, it's part of their performance of characters as a spy. But we might also argue that it's a part of this person's identity, that it is their choice, it's their own self-expression. And we might want to think, well, does it really matter? But of course it does matter, because we have these conversations in modern society, particularly today. So it sort of taps into some quite current debates between scholars about how you describe people, gender and sex in the past. And if we look at the history of Chevalier D'Eon, we find them variously described as an androgynous individual or as a cross-dresser, or sometimes they are described as the first transvestite man recorded in history. They've also been recorded as transgender. So, the terminology itself that we're reaching out for to describe this history kinds of brings to the fore some of the difficulties we have in applying our modern terminology to the experiences of the past.
Yeah, it's a very tricky thing to work out. But if we're to stick with the gender norms and ideals of the 18th century, tell us more about them. Were they rigidly policed, as we might imagine?
I suppose what's interesting when we try and visit the Chevalier D'Eon story from the present is that in the 18th century language, there isn't the same range of terminology that we might use today. So, the words which we've heard used to describe the Chevalier by historians in terms of androgyny or transvestite or transgender are not ones which feature in the 18th century terminology. The discussions in the Chevalier's own history is this person a man? Is this person truly a woman? What is the sex of their birth? And could they possibly be both at the same time? And that's the sort of the way in which this story, I suppose, is approached by contemporaries at the time.
Are there any other figures that we know about who flouted this era's gender norms in the same way that the Chevalier did?
Well, there's certainly some other kind of contemporary resonances which people would have been aware of at the time. One of the kinds of current stories of the age was the idea that occasionally women might dress as soldiers or sailors in order to either have adventure abroad or to join their loved one on some military mission. And those sorts of stories, some of which are taken from life, kind of can capture a contemporary imagination that somebody could dress as a different sex, have a life as that person, and sort of not be uncovered at any particular time. So there's a sort of interest in it as a almost romantic narrative in some ways. And we know from the work of historians who've studied a kind of queer culture of the 18th century that this is also a time when molly houses, so places that offered the opportunity for homosexual men to meet, also offered the opportunity for men to cross-dress and to dress as women. But those spaces and those meeting places were often incredibly secret and underground. They're not in any way a kind of part of a broader popular culture, but it is part of the landscape that this scandal and story of the celebrity Chevalier D'Eon operates in.
So, to pick back up on our story, as you mentioned, the Chevalier decided to stay in London and had built up some notoriety, some fame by this point. What did they do with that newfound fame?
Well, it's not entirely clear if they did anything in particular, but what we do know is that 1771, so when our story started, there has been a whipping up of a gambling craze with people placing bets on whether or not this famous individual now, the Chevalier D'Eon, was originally a man or originally born a woman. It becomes a craze, and because it's a craze, it becomes a kind of point of national interest, really, a kind of prurient curiosity about the true sex of the Chevalier. So, Ellie, just to give you a sense of sort of what's happening in London at this time around these wagers, why don't you have a look at one of these images here, which is actually satirising this betting craze.
Okay, so here we have a group of men, and we have the Chevalier dressed as a man, I think quite interestingly, here on the left, and it's everybody betting on whether they're a man or they're a woman. But the facial expressions are quite interesting in this. There's kind of shock, confusion, intrigue, all portrayed here. Yeah,
they're all kind of looking perplexed and baffled. And also the issue with these wagers is, how is anyone ever going to prove it one or the other? And one of the rumours that began to circulate was that maybe the Chevalier D'Eon was purposefully generating this gossip, these rumours themselves, in order to profit financially in some way by taking secret backhanders from somebody, a bit of insider trading, that they were somehow implicated in this story themselves, that they were causing it, they were creating it.
Interesting. So like a classic case of a celebrity building their own mythos and scandal and intrigue.
Yes, potentially. And that sort of takes a particular turn in some ways when D'Eon suddenly just disappears from public view. So the gambling craze has kind of reached a peak, and then the celebrity at the centre of it all, just goes into hiding. Because disappears.
There's two ways you could interpret that, right? One is that they disappeared because this was all too much. They wanted to get away from all this attention. Yep. The other way to interpret it is, this will add to the story.
Yeah. And I don't think we can ever know that. So it's kind of, pick your own story, really. Which one is it?
But I'm guessing that they did come back.
They did indeed. There's advertisements being placed, saying, can you find this individual? We need to settle these bets. Where has D'Eon disappeared to? So eventually, the Chevalier D'Eon reappears, and they swear an oath that, firstly, they hadn't been involved in any of the bets or the kind of wagers that have been taking place. They haven't taken any bribes from anybody. They haven't been complicit in any kind of whipping up of any of this story. They also present a kind of face of being outraged and indignant that they should be the subject of such gossip. And they also declined any request to participate in any kind of physical examination.
Fair enough.
But one of the things that does happen at one point is D'Eon certainly presents a public face of being completely outraged that anybody should question, whether they are a man or a woman. And actually what they do, and it could, again, just be to generate further publicity, they go charging into a tavern, or it's possibly a coffee house, dressed in full military uniform, kind of wielding their sword to challenge a banker to a duel, which is sort of the ultimate expression of macho masculinity at the time. So whether that's strategic or a genuine outrage, we can never know, but it kind of adds to the performance of it all and the drama of the story.
Yeah, it's yet another extraordinary episode in their life. So after this interlude with the gambling, challenging bankers to duels, did the Chevalier continue with any spying or diplomacy work?
Well, remarkably, yes. So for reasons that I don't quite fully understand, having presented themselves as a whistleblower, sort of almost effectively attempting to blackmail the king in France, they continue to work intermittently as a kind of diplomat and messenger, a spy, passing information back to France. And they even returned to Paris at one point in the late 1770s. And kind of remarkably at this moment, which just further adds to their incredible story, the king, when D'Eon returns to Paris, the king grants them a very large pension in exchange for finally getting his hands on the stash of secret papers that D'Eon has been carrying around at the time. But the terms and conditions of those pensions stated that from that time on, D'Eon, who was then dressing and living as a man, must dress and live as a woman.
Which is quite a very strange addendum to include in any agreement.
Yes. Again, we don't know, because D'Eon then kicks up a smokescreen about why this should be, but a story emerges that D'Eon themselves are saying they had always been a girl and a woman at birth, and that was their original identity, but they had been a girl performing as a man for the purposes of diplomacy and spying, but from this date on they wanted to return to their original identity as a woman. Now, whether that's just another layer of a story that is created by this incredibly clever and charismatic individual, or whether that is the real biography of the Chevalier, I can't possibly answer that question. But we do know that from that date on, D'Eon, they return to London again and does live as a woman until their death in 1810. Except, not quite, because there also seems to be some evidence that at moments whilst living in France, when they wore military dress and occasionally dressed as a man, they were imprisoned for doing so. Okay, so, all that we discover is other layers of complexity.
So was there a point at which public interest died down in Chevalier's gender?
No, not really. The story just continues to unfold. So, we'll remember there was this big gambling craze that was going on, all these wagers that had been placed. The issue was that those wagers needed to reach a conclusion. Like when people place a bet, they expect there to be some final moment in which the outcome is revealed. And so this posed a problem for people in London, because it appeared as though there was never going to be an answer to this question about whether Chevalier was a man or a woman. In 1777, actually, a case is even brought at the Court of the King's Bench, where the plaintiff in the case claims to have been owed 700 guineas by the defendant in order to honour a bet that they had placed. And the bet was that the plaintiff had asserted that they would be able to prove that D'Eon was a woman. And so what happens in the court case is that the plaintiff has to make good this proof. And I should say that, the Chevalier themselves is not involved at all in these negotiations. It's all entirely between the plaintiff and the defendant. But what happens is the plaintiff presents a number of medical witnesses, allegedly from France, who claim to have known D'Eon personally and testify that D'Eon was, in their words, quote, a natural woman. And so the court actually rules that the plaintiff has proven the sex of the Chevalier D'Eon and should be paid the winnings. But we shouldn't presume that actually that means that anyone has really decided what the outcome is. It's simply that the court case determines that the plaintiff has produced enough evidence that they can claim their winnings.
It's all very complicated. Is that the end of the Chevalier story?
No. No, the story continues. Fast forward a little bit to 1780s London. The Chevalier D'Eon has returned and is now living and dressing as a woman, Madame D'Eon. And Madame D'Eon is short of money and trying to generate an income. And so they achieve this by really giving fencing lessons and kind of lessons in swordsmanship to anyone who'll pay, and also giving kind of impressive shows of their skill in public while wearing women's dress. So what we find in 1780s London is now the Chevalier D'Eon, or Madame D'Eon, is a celebrity performer. Part of a world of kind of actresses and circus people and entertainers. And we see them completing a number of kind of public, fairly, popular displays of their skill, sometimes partnered by an actress, Mrs. Bateman, with both of the individuals in full female dress, which, was seen as part of the kind of remarkable aspect of their show. And if you have a look, you can see, an example of a print that was created at the time of D'Eon fencing whilst dressed as a woman.
Well, I have to say, looking at this print, that they look pretty formidable. I don't think you'd want to take them on.
No, certainly not. And certainly part of the appeal seems to have been this kind of, mismatch between the idea of a gentlemanly sport, a very masculine sport, fencing and fighting, and then the ornate female dress.
So we've already charted a really long and eventful life. What do we know about their final years?
Well, we know that D'Eon is now living in London as a woman, and they lodged for a number of years with a lady called Mrs. Mary Cole, who runs a boarding house effectively. This person acted as their housekeeper. And Mrs. Mary Cole really believed that Madame D'Eon was a madam, that they were women together, kind of elderly women, spinsters. And when D'Eon died, aged 81, because there was so much public interest in their identity and their life, a post-mortem examination was taken place of their body. And the conclusion was, by the surgeons who undertook that examination, and we quote from their report, that they found male organs in every respect perfectly formed. And apparently Mrs. Mary Cole was so shocked to discover that Madame D'Eon may have been Chevalier D'Eon, that she never recovered from the shock. I mean, it's sort of remarkable, isn't it, that despite the complexity of this person's life, what must have been remarkable achievements in terms of their professional career as, well, initially in the military and then as a diplomat and then as a spy, as a celebrity, as a person of public fame and notoriety, despite all of the ways in which that story could have been written, at the moment of their death, the question still remained, we should find out whether this individual is a man or woman.
So, Hannah, how would you characterise public opinion towards D'Eon at the time? I mean, we have the betting scandal. On one hand, as we've discussed, that could be quite humiliating and prurient. On the other hand, they could have fueled it to help their own celebrity. But also their success in life suggests that it wasn't quite so simple as straightforward mockery, was it?
No, it's not. It's not a mockery. It's even something different to curiosity, because they are clearly rightly regarded as a clever, interesting, successful, professional person, a person of interest because of their links to governments and information and power brokers, and so they kind of belie any simple categorizations, not simply to do with categorizations of identity and sex and gender, but also categorizations of what celebrity is, or how a person's biography should be written, because I think you could write their biography in so many different ways. It's not a kind of simple story of a scandal of celebrity in the way that we might see with others. And certainly they were an individual who commanded a lot of respect from people as well, and support. And actually, in 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft, in her very famous Vindication of the Rights of Women, she actually named Madame D'Eon as one of the few women who she truly admired, as an example of a woman who displays courage and excellence because of their incredible education, that the way in which they'd had a sort of masculine education, for want of a better phrase, they were able to achieve great things in life. And for Wollstonecraft, that was an example of what a feminist could do or achieve, or exactly why women should be empowered and educated. So, again, then the story of the Chevalier D'Eon or Madame D'Eon moves into all of these different kinds of avenues and quarters. I mean, I think another example of the possible kind of contemporary respect that was given to D'Eon and, the respect they commanded is the fact that they don't simply feature in a kind of world of prurient satire or caricature or mockery. As a notorious figure of the time, their portrait is painted, numerously in the same way that other influential people are painted in their portraiture, sort of without a particular judgment on their true identity, but just it seems to be an effort to capture themselves. I had a question myself about, presenting D'Eon as a scandal in a kind of podcast on scandals, because it suggests that we are simply reiterating that kind of contemporary moment of preoccupation about whether this individual is a man or a woman, and whether that question really matters or not. Because, when you start to look into the history of the Chevalier D'Eon, Madame D'Eon, their history is so complex and fascinating, and the potential for their achievements to be recognised often seems to be overlooked. I mean, they are, you could just write of them as a diplomat or just as a spy. Why should that question of whether or not they're a man or woman still be the one that predominates today? And even kind of contemporaries wondered that themselves, whether they questioned themselves as to whether or not that interest really mattered. So, for instance, in 1781, when D'Eon's celebrity was once again rising in London, and Madame D'Eon is presenting these fencing shows, the Annual Register wrote of them, and I quote, "It must indeed be acknowledged that she is the most extraordinary person of the age. We have seen no one who has united so many military, political and literary talents." And so even contemporaries were saying, look, they refer to her as a she, but that doesn't really matter. There's this one individual who has brought together all of these spheres of influence, and that should be what matters.
And what do you think that the Chevalier's story can reveal about the Georgian age?
Well, it reveals that it's almost impossible to have a conversation, Ellie, without talking about betting and gambling and placing wagers. It tells us something about how celebrity culture operates in the Georgian era, about how a person can become incredibly notorious. But, the Chevalier has so many different aspects and facets to their life, none of which we can ever really, truly know. So they're something of an enigma, I think. And I suppose that's one of the things that makes them so intriguing.